Hello everyone, my name is Christy Arzola and I'm a watercolor artist. I have been painting for over 15 years. These are some samples of my art. If you're interested in seeing more, please feel free to visit my website. I can also be found on Facebook and Instagram. Here's a sample of the painting we'll be completing today. I invite you to paint along with me. Download the reference photo using the link in the video description. For your convenience, I've identified all parts of this video with the timestamps. For quick navigation, you can go to the video description and select the hyperlinks. And remember, if you like what you see here today, please give me a thumbs up and consider subscribing. Please gather the following materials for today's lesson. The materials I'll be using today is a Fabriano 5x7 watercolor block, a Cotman flat brush as well as a wash brush, a silver number 12 round, a Mimik number 6 round, a Silverwhite number 2 round, brush cleaner, masking fluid. I'll also be using a rubber cement pickup, kitchen sponge, Blick art palette, a range of Cotman watercolors, paint water, and an ultrafine mist water sprayer. These are the colors that we'll be using in today's painting. If you don't have these paints, that's okay. Just use what you have and get as close as possible. Now, before we get started with today's poppy painting, I want you to sketch out your flower. If you are comfortable with freehanding your poppy like I did, I kind of created my own composition. I just want to make sure that you are using a hard lead pencil. I use a 4H, and this ensures that the graphite doesn't shift and move under the moisture of my watercolor paints. Now, if you're not comfortable sketching it freehand, what you can do is you can take a standard number 2 pencil, rub graphite on the back. You can flip your reference photo over so the graphite's touching your watercolor paper, and you can secure it in place with a piece of tape. Then I want you to take a ballpoint pen and apply pressure and trace your subject. After tracing just a short ways, I want you to lift your reference photo and take a peek to make sure you applied enough pressure for the transfer to be successful. You want a soft gray line. You don't want anything that's too dark. Another tool I want you to invest in is a kneaded eraser. You can find them in any craft store in the drawing section. They cost maybe 75 cents. And these allow you to apply pressure over top of your pencil lines to make sure that you soften any lines that are dark. It really helps out because then the pencil lines aren't as visible in the finished painting. When you apply masking fluid, something I recommend you do is use a cheap brush that you don't care about. Get the bristles wet with water first, and use either brush cleaner or a standard bar of soap at home to coat the outside of your brush with this soap. That's going to leave residue on the brush bristles, and it's going to provide a layer of protection between your brush and the masking fluid itself, because this stuff dries really quickly, and once it dries on the bristles of your brush will be ruined. So remember to rinse frequently and constantly coat the bristles of your brush using soap or brush cleaner. Once your poppy is drawn, I'm going to ask you to apply what is called masking fluid to the outside edge of your poppy. Now, if you don't have this in stock, that's okay. Just be careful with your brush control to avoid your poppy. But this is a liquid that will dry to a plastic-like finish which resists the paint itself. It's going to ensure that we're successful at getting those vibrant yellows and oranges, and that they don't get muddied up by some of our blues and greens that we use in our background. When you apply masking fluid, something I recommend you do is use a cheap brush that you don't care about. Get the bristles wet with water first, and use either brush cleaner or a standard bar of soap at home to coat the outside of your brush with this soap. That's going to leave residue on the brush bristles, and it's going to provide a layer of protection between your brush and the masking fluid itself, because this stuff dries really quickly, and once it dries on the bristles of your brush will be ruined. So remember to rinse frequently and constantly coat the bristles of your brush using soap or brush cleaner. Now you can see where I've applied the masking fluid. I've gone along the outside edge of my poppy, and I've got a nice consistent gloss, which lets me know I have good coverage and that I don't have any masking fluid that's too thin. I've also masked the stem of my poppy as well as a forward leaf. Before you begin your painting, make sure you dump out any paint water that you use to rinse your masking fluid with. If you try to paint with that dirty water, it will actually dull the appearance of paints. So always start with clean water. Never paint with masking fluid water. I also want you to use a squirt bottle to activate your paints. This will allow them to become moist before you begin your painting, making it easier to get vibrant colors. Now that I've activated my paints and allowed them to sit, I'm going to wet the entire background using clean water. For this, I'm going to use a mop brush, which holds a lot of water and it allows me to go faster. Now, since I have masked the outside edge of my flower, including the stem and forward leaf, I'm able to wet my background more efficiently without worry of accidentally getting water into my main subject. Now, if you do not have masking fluid, that's okay. I just want you to take clean water and slowly go around the outside edge of your poppy, wetting just the background, and avoid the flower, stem, and leaf. It might take you a little longer and you'll probably have to do a couple coats, but it can still be done. Before you begin adding color to your background, I want you to take a moment to really look closely and make sure you have a nice even gloss across your background. You should not have any standing puddles. All the water should be even, and you should be able to still see the texture of the paper through your water, but there should definitely be a high gloss. Once you have a good consistent gloss and your paper is staying damp and no longer drying so quickly, I want you to begin with your light values first. I'm going to put some lemon yellow in a few areas to imply poppies in the background. But as I do this, I need to keep perspective in mind. I should have larger poppies towards the foreground and smaller poppies towards the back. I also want the shape and size of my poppies to vary. Now, while you are painting wet into wet, I want you to keep in mind that the size of the brush you use is going to play a factor. The smaller the brush you use, it's going to hold less color. Therefore, when you bring it to your painting, it's going to make smaller shapes. If you use a larger brush, it's going to hold quite a bit more paint. So when you bring it to your wet background, it's going to want to release that larger amount, making larger shapes. While you're painting, if you accidentally get puddling on the surface of your paper, I want you to rinse your brush, dry it off using a paper towel or sponge, and blot that area to absorb the color and kind of keep it in the area you intended. You can also press down firmly with a paper towel to blot and then just re-wet with clean water. Once I have my lemon yellow in place, I'm going to continue to build on my values. Next color I'm going to use is cadmium yellow, and I don't want to cover up all of my lemon yellow. I want to simply break it up into a little bit more interesting shapes. And in order for me to really know what shapes are appropriate for the subject, I'm going to keep my eyes going back and forth between my painting and my reference photo. Although I put together my own composition, doesn't necessarily mean that I know what blurred poppies will look like in the background of my painting. So this reference photo is very helpful in determining shapes and sizes as I build my values. After my cadmium yellow, I'm going to use cadmium orange. If you don't have cadmium orange, you can always mix cadmium yellow and cadmium red to get the same color. But I'm looking at my reference photo to determine where I have some of these light oranges in my poppies. If I take my time and really give my eyes time to see the flowers in the reference photo, I'll be able to successfully imply those folds in the petals and the beautiful shape that these flowers have. As you're painting, keep an eye on your colors and make sure that they are not bleeding into areas that you didn't intend, and just use that blotting technique that we talked about earlier to keep things under control. We're going to continue applying these cadmium oranges to each flower. After our cadmium orange, I'm going to continue up my value scale and add some cadmium red. As you're painting, I want you to keep an eye on the outside edge of your shape. Make sure it doesn't become too circular or oval, because that's not going to look natural when it comes to nature. And just apply some more paint to break up that outside edge of your shape. If you feel like you're beginning to lose some of those bright yellows, just return to them and add them on the outside edge of your poppy so you have that nice range of values. In addition to my cadmium red, I'm going to mix a deeper hue that includes a little bit of the alizarin crimson, and that's going to make a really nice deep red that's going to push my values and give me a nice range. I'm a big fan of contrast when I'm painting, so I really like to push those dark values. My paper's beginning to lose some of that gloss, so I know I'm going to have to either spritz with my fine water mister, or I'm going to have to start picking up my pace to ensure that my paper doesn't dry quicker than I'd like. I'm just using some blotting with my brush to push and pull my colors to make sure that they don't drag out and become larger than I intended. I really need to be aware of the contrast with this rear poppy and my main poppy, because if we look at the reference photo, my main poppy has a lot of bright yellows and soft oranges on the left edge, and if I want that to stand out, I need to push the contrast of the flower behind it so I have good contrast in my end painting. Now that I have built my values on the poppies on the left side of my painting, I'm going to continue to that method and build the values on the right side. So I've returned to my cadmium orange, and again I'm just going to break up the shapes a little bit. And don't forget to look at your reference photo to pull inspiration. I don't want you to guess. That's the whole point of having a reference photo, to kind of give us some guidance so we know where to apply the colors. After we have some cadmium orange, I want you to build your values using that cadmium red. And if you choose, really push the contrast with that cadmium red and alizarin crimson. Now you may have noticed that I am not necessarily the fastest painter. I like to take my time and just enjoy the process. But with this being said, my background is now starting to lose some of that shine, so I know I need to begin to boogie to finish this up. So with a really soft value of sap green, I'm going to put in some grasses to break up the negative space that is around the poppies in the background. I need to make sure that I am skipping over my poppies when I come in contact with them. And if I do have any grasses that go behind my main poppy in the foreground, I need to make sure to carry that grass through to the opposite side. Because of the stage of my background and the fact that it's already begun to dry, I may get what is called blooming, but over the years I've come to really enjoy the unpredictability of blooms, and I find them to be something very beautiful, and I think they add interest to a painting. Now I can add a little bit of blue to my green to darken the tones for the foreground grasses. And I can even apply some shapes for the leaves. If you have any areas that are completely dry, you can just soften the edges of your paint strokes using a damp brush. If there are areas of your painting that have completely dried, you can go in and apply clean water. Just keep some distance between your brush and the paint that you've already applied so that you don't get any heavy blooming. And then I want you to mix up a light value of cerulean blue to go in between your flowers and green grasses. Since I'm working with a damp background already, these soft blues are going to move, so I don't feel the need to get right up close next to my poppies. I want to give them a respectful distance, also because oranges and blues, when they come together, can often make these brown neutral tones that you didn't intend. So I rather have the blues soften towards the flowers than get too close. I don't want my blues to be too dark because I feel like it would detract from the main subject. But I'm going to slowly put them into all these small negative spaces that are left behind, trying to fill in some of that white. And if blooming happens, I'm honestly just going to embrace it. Oftentimes I find that there are happy accidents that occur when you allow the paints to just be. If any of your soft blues are creeping into your bright yellows, just use that blotting method with a clean, almost dry brush to push some of those soft blues back. If you don't know what a bloom is, I will show you. So this poppy down here began to dry, and when I brought in my soft blues for the sky, since my poppy wasn't completely dry, it began to push back into that flower space, creating this irregular edge, which is the bloom itself. Now before my background dries completely, I'm going to use some of that deep red mixture with the alizarin crimson and cadmium red, and I'm going to really make sure to push the values of my rear poppies before my background dries completely. Last step before it dries, I'm going to mix in some additional blues to my sap green to really push it to a darker green. And I'm going to do some foreground grasses because, again, I want to have that range of values in all elements of my painting. If there's an area that you feel became too dark in value, just blot quickly with your paper towel before it dries and you can correct that value. I'm happy to say our background is done. Let's see how it looks when it dries. Look closely at the reference photo. We'll notice this Italian ryegrass that's through the background. We've also got a few buds that we need to incorporate. In my composition, I went ahead and I sketched out an area for one of these Italian grasses that goes right in front of these left two flowers. But I can't paint it in yet because if I were to try and layer my greens over top of these bright oranges and reds, it would just muddy up the appearance of my greens, turning out more as a brown. So I'm going to take this opportunity and use a flat brush, put some water on it, and I'm going to do little circular motions to scrub and lift that color in the area where I want my grass. Once I feel like I've lifted a small section, I'm going to dab with a paper towel to lift the color, and then I will re-rinse my brush and lift again. I'm going to repeat this process for the full length of the grass that comes in contact or goes in front of some of these rear poppies. Once I have successfully lifted the color, I can then layer in some of my greens on top with more success, and I'll have less browns. I'm also going to lift a small area where I have a little bud drawn out in this bottom corner. I also have a leaf on this right side, and I'm just going to soften some of the colors that are in the body of that leaf, so when I do a glaze of green on top, it's a nice consistent value. Now I know all this lifting does take quite a while, but it's worth it in the end. And once I'm done lifting the colors in the areas of my foreground subjects, I'm going to have to make sure that it's completely dry using a blow dryer before I can do glazes on top. This will ensure that we get nice, crisp, clean edges and it reads nicely. I'm going to mix up some sap green, and to get a darker value, I'm going to rinse my brush and add a little bit of that cerulean blue. And with a small round brush, I'm just going to slowly go in through the top, creating that texture. Taking my time to try and stay inside the shape of my object. And for comfort, I'm going to rotate my watercolor block so that I can get some of these angles with ease. And using really light pressure, holding my brush almost vertical, I'm going to touch just the tip of my brush, allowing me to get these small narrow lines, and I'm going to bring the grass all the way off the edge of my painting. I'm going to use this same dark green for the bud that's in the foreground. If I have any big standing puddles, I'm going to rinse my brush, dry it off on a sponge, and blot the surface to bring the water level down so it's more controllable. I'm going to add some purple lake to my dark green, and I'm just going to selectively add a few darker values throughout my bud and the grass. There's this wonderful top texture to the bud that almost looks like dots. I'm going to paint those with my purple lake and green mixture. I'm going to add a little bit of that same dark value to the bottom of the bud just to give some dimension and form. I will also apply this dark green to the leaf that is on the right side of my painting. This will just give nice color balance for my overall image. And I'm going to let this dry before removing the masking fluid. Now that the paint has dried, I can use a rubber cement pickup or my fingers to remove the masking fluid from my flower, stem, and leaf. One thing I like about the rubber cement pickup is the masking fluid automatically balls up and bonds to the edges of the rubber cement pickup, and it minimizes some of the mess all over my workstation. If you're using your hands, just make sure your hands are clean and make sure to double check your painting surface that all of the masking fluid is removed before beginning your painting. First thing we want to do is establish our light values in our flower. So to do this, I'm going to wet the entire surface of my poppy using clean water. Now with any wet into wet technique, the first layer of water is going to be absorbed into the paper quite quickly. So we're probably going to have to do 2 to 3 layers before we notice that the gloss and shine of our paper sticks around, indicating that the paper is remaining damp enough for us to begin paint. If it's easier for your hand, I want you to rotate your paper allowing you to get up close to certain edges with ease and comfort. Don't feel like you have to keep your paper completely straight. For the main body of the flower, I've been using a large round, but once I feel like the entire flower is filled, I'm going to switch my brush to a smaller round. That way I can get up to the very edge with confidence, using a brush that has a good point. If you don't take your time and bring the clean water all the way to your pencil's edge, what's going to happen is when you apply paint, you're going to get a faint, thin white line that identifies where your water line ended and where you began to hit dry paper. So take your time, apply your water as neatly as possible, and you'll be grateful that you did. Now, as you can see, I have a nice consistent coverage. I can see a gloss that goes across the entire surface of my flower. If there are any areas that do not have a gloss and it's more matte in appearance, I will take the time to apply a second layer. But I also want to make sure that my water is evenly distributed and no big puddles are standing on the surface. If there are, then I can just use the absorbency of my brush to pick up some of those puddles so it's a little bit more controllable. Now that the flower is wet and holding a gloss, I'm going to begin with lemon yellow, and we're going to apply this lemon yellow to the top rear petal that is backlit with the sun. Going at a nice slow, steady pace up against my pencil edge. It's not necessary to try and keep the lemon yellow in those backlit areas. If it accidentally bleeds or extends into our orange areas of our flower, that's okay because our orange is a darker value and will easily cover it up. It also helps that the yellows and oranges are both in the same. It also helps that the yellows and oranges are both warm colors and on the same side of the color wheel, so I know that they will blend and layer nicely. To get a nice crisp edge, I like to trace the outside edge in one fluid stroke as much as possible so I have a nice neat product. Without this step, we run the risk of having jagged edges that won't look as appealing in the end, so taking the time to trace the outside edge is really worth it in the end. We have a small sliver of bright yellows on the right center of the flower. And while this is still wet, this is a great opportunity to put in some subtle value changes with some soft oranges to imply some of that petal texture. So I'm going to start with using some cadmium yellow. I don't want it too dark, so I'm going to make sure there's enough water in my paint for a soft value. And using light pressure and a small brush, I'm going to add some lines to indicate some of those value changes that I see in my reference photo. I don't want my lines to all be the same height because it's not going to look natural. I also want to have a variety of spacing in between them. That will also help. So I'm going around into all of the lemon yellow sections with this cadmium yellow, adding some subtle lines to imply that petal texture. I'm going to add a little bit of cadmium red, pale hue, to some of these darker values in the backlit petals. Add more water to it so it's not too strong. And I want to just pay attention to those few select darks that are in these vibrant yellow petals. I'm going to take a clean, practically dry brush, and I'm going to use it to blot in the areas of the orange petals, pushing back on some of that lemon yellow so it's not too strong. This just helps me get a really nice, predictable product when I start the next part of this painting. Now I'm not going to be able to get the final level of details on these yellow petals yet, but this is at least a great start, and I need to let this dry before I can begin painting the foreground petals in this poppy. Now to begin the orange petals, we're going to have to break it up into two parts. We will start with this top center petal first, and then when it's dried, we will do this petal that goes across the front. So using clean water, I want you to wet this top center orange petal, and once you have a good gloss, we can begin adding color. This is a pretty dark petal, so I'm going to use cadmium red pale, and I'm just going to block in this entire petal before I start working petal texture and detail. To get those clean edges, I'm attempting to trace the outside edge of my petal using my brush. Hopefully in as few of strokes as possible so that I don't get a chopped up, jagged looking edge. We have to remember that the water on the surface of our paper is going to further dilute our value. So if you want vibrant color, make sure you mix your color about 20% darker than the value you want it to dry and appear as. Now before this cadmium red dries, I can use blotting by removing any moisture or color from my brush and dragging my practically dry brush through some of the highlighted areas in my petal that might have a softer value. I can also add some darker reds using the alizarin crimson and cadmium red, and by doing some light touches with just the tip of my brush, I can create some of that line texture through the petal, pulling towards the center bottom. If I accidentally get outside my shape, that's okay. We can fix that later when it's dry. Along the right edge of the flower, there's some dark reds. By laying these in, it's going to give a little bit more contour to our petal as if it is folding around. To keep it under control though, you can kind of blot and make sure that those dark reds don't creep too far into the center of your petal. When your petal begins to lose its gloss or shine, that means you're nearing the end of your working time and you need to allow it to dry completely before beginning that next forward petal. Now that the flower petal is completely dry, we can use a small flat brush, dip it in some clean water, make sure it's damp, and we can do small circular motions to basically scrub and lift that area that accidentally got outside our petal shape. We also want to make sure that we have a nice contour to this forward petal and the way it bends. If I were to imagine a line going straight through so that it's a nice subtle curve that continues, I'll notice that I accidentally got a little too wide with my petal shape, so I need to lift a little bit in this area as well so I can give it a nice contour. And I will need to dry this before I proceed to the next step. Now the process we are going to do for this forward petal is we're basically going to wet the entire shape with clean water using a similar method that we did to the previous petal. Going nice and slow up against our edges to make sure that we don't go outside our boundaries. If you accidentally get outside your petal shape with your clean water, just use a dry paper towel and press firmly over the area that you did not want to get wet, and that'll pick it up. So remember, these are not the steps that you want to rush. The way you apply your water is equally as important as the way you apply your paint, especially if you want to have clean edges to your shape that read really realistically. Once we have a nice even gloss across our petal shape, we're going to refer to our reference photo and find the lightest value of orange in this forward petal. So I'm going to start with cadmium orange, and I'm going to apply this color along the right edge. I'm taking my time, making sure not to rush, rotating my watercolor paper to make it easier on myself. And I'm going to carry this cadmium orange across the bottom edge of this entire folded petal. Now I'm going to rinse my brush and use some of that cadmium red pale, and I'm going to fill in the white areas of this petal. Now I know right now the colors aren't blending and looking quite right. But after I clean up the edges of this petal, I'll rinse my brush and remove all the paint and water from it. And I'm going to use my brush as a tool to move the reds and oranges back and forth through this center area where they're not blended. And by doing this, I'm able to create more of a gradual gradient, and it's much more realistic now. Now that we've worked out that gradient, I'm going to want to lift out just a few highlights. So I'm going to rinse my brush and remove all moisture from it, and I'm going to use it to blot and soften some of the values in the lightest areas that I see in this petal. Now I'm going to use some of that alizarin crimson and cerulean blue with a little bit of that cadmium red pale. to make a deep mauve color. Test out my values to make sure it's the color that I want. And pulling towards the center of the flower with light pressure, I'm going to add some darker lines just to add to the texture of my petals. I'm making sure to follow the contour, and if you look at the reference photo, the right petal has quite a few wavy lines in the shadows and lines of it. So I'm making sure to reference that for inspiration. This central area of the petal is quite a bit darker than the sides. So I'm going to layer this mauve color over top, and I'm just going to selectively darken a few of the front edges. Now that I have some wonderful texture on this petal, I'm going to let it dry completely, and we can do additional details on top. Now if we look closely at our reference photo, you'll notice that this forward petal has a fold that goes behind and is also backlit. But unfortunately, with the values that we've currently achieved with our lemon yellow, it's kind of hard to distinguish the difference between these two areas. But the fold should be slightly lighter in value. So to increase the contrast between these two sections, I'm going to put some cadmium yellow right behind this fold of the flower. And I'm just painting it in directly. And I'm going to extend this cadmium yellow almost to the top edge of this rear petal. And I will also soften the edges so it blends nicely with the rest of the petal. And that does help make it a little easier for the eye to distinguish between the two areas. Now I'm going to use a soft value of cadmium orange mixed with cadmium yellow because I just want to add some subtle line details to these backlit petals. And if I go too dark, it's not going to look right. I imagine these tiny details are probably really hard to see through the video, but if you look closely at your reference photo, you'll notice those subtle textures that the petals have, and that's simply what I'm trying to capture. Now I don't want all of my lines to be evenly spaced or to end at the same length. I want there to be some variations. I'm going to do the same thing for this top petal that is also backlit. Following the contour of the petal, I'm just going to add some line details. I'm also going to use some of the cadmium red pale mixed with my cadmium orange to get a slightly darker value to identify this fold that we have on this top left corner. We also have some darker values identifying the folds in between these two orange petals on the right side. And there's just a few select areas within the body of the petal that have a little darker shadows in the folds and line work. Look at your photo for inspiration. I don't want you to make the mistake of forgetting about your reference photo and just making lines out of habit. I want your eyes to be constantly going back and forth between your painting and your reference photo. It's going to guide you. Now these orange petals in our flower also have some line detail as well. So using that dark red mauve mixture, I'm going to start at the base of my flower and put in some of these lines. And before it dries, I'm going to use a damp brush to just pull the top edge of these lines up so that they soften and have a gradient that goes more from dark to light. I can add the same line work on the forward petal as well. But if you look at your reference photo, there's quite a few wavy lines inside the line texture of this poppy. So give yourself a moment to really look closely to determine what kind of lines you need to make. As you're making these lines, I want you to remember to follow the contour of the fold. That's just going to add to the realism of your painting. You can soften the edges of some of your line work with just a damp brush to blend it more easily with the surrounding colors. Just make sure you're using a quality brush with light pressure so you don't lift those glazes that are underneath. I'm going to mix an even darker value of mauve to add a little bit more dimension to my flower. Because we have quite a few dark colors that are central to the flower, and if I really push the contrast here, it should read more realistically. I'm also going to push the line detail on this top petal, but I am rinsing my brush and softening that top edge so there's more of a gradient that goes from dark to light. If you lay down some lines that you feel might be a little too dark in value, just keep your paper towel handy so you can blot the surface, which will lighten them and make them a little less intense. We also have this tiny little fold here on the very bottom edge of this petal. So I'm going to paint in a half moon shape to make that fold a little more obvious and easier for the eye to determine. Now I'm still not happy with the contrast I have between this fold and the backlit petal, so I'm going to use a flat brush and I'm going to lift the top edge of the fold to kind of push the contrast a little further. I want it to be a softer yellow, and that right there helped a lot. I'm going to mix up some sap green and paint in the stem of my flower. Now I wouldn't have been able to do this if the yellows on my flower were still wet, so make sure that they're dry before you go into the stem. Right now I'm just going to paint it the same value of green all the way down. And like anything in our painting, just because we're excited to see the end product, I don't think we should overlook the values in the stem. So mix up a darker green and put just a thin line of darker green down the right edge of your stem. That's going to give it more form. We're going to take the same sap green and we're going to fill in this left-hand leaf. Make sure you have enough water on your brush so you get good solid coverage. Now since we have so many vibrant lemon yellows in our flower, I'm going to add some lemon yellow to my sap green mixture to add a little bit more of a highlight towards the top half of the leaf. I'm going to add a little bit more lemon yellow just to push that contrast so it's a little easier to decipher from the background grass leaves. And I want to add some darker greens to the bottom edge of this leaf. From this point forward, I feel like you can determine what additional details you would like to add. But I do feel happy with how it turned out, and I hope it was a positive experience for you as well. I hope you enjoyed today's painting as much as I did. If you liked what I did here today, please give me a thumbs up, consider subscribing, or select on the bell to receive notifications. I'm also open to receiving comments or suggestions on what lessons I might prepare next. Have a great rest of your day.